Poetry is about human business. During tough times, during hard times, people really turn to poetry to remember, I think, the best of what humanity is able to be to each other. When things are falling apart and things are uncertain, I feel like poetry kind of breaks everything down to what's essential, what really matters.
Welcome to the Zami Nobla National Organization of Black Lesbians on Aging podcast. We are your sound source for Black lesbian herstory. I'm your host, Angela Denise Davis. April is National Poetry Month, and in this Zami Nobla episode, we talk with poet Kamilah Aisha Moon about her life as a poet and professor.
My name is Kamilah Aisha Moon, and how I show up in the world. I show up as a daughter, as a sister, as a friend, as a woman interested in those around her. I try to look at things differently and not take them for granted. I like to see what I've seen day in, day out and see it in a new way. I like to laugh. I like to celebrate myself and others. I like to remember those who came before and continue the good work that they've started.
Well, we are so glad you're part of the Zami Nobla podcast today, especially as we highlight Poetry Month for the month of April.
Yes.
And it is a pleasure to highlight your work. Tell us a little bit about the work you do as a teacher of poetry.
Yes, I'm an assistant professor of poetry at Agnes Scott College, and but I've taught poetry in many capacities for many years. Mm-hmm. So when I was in New York, I taught children quite a bit. Mm. I was a teaching artist in the public schools, and I would go in and introduce them to poets and let them find their voices through different exercises, and we put on shows and things of that nature. And then as I became a serious writer within my own right, and then I would teach it more formally in high schools and then college. You teach craft, right? You mm-hmm. teach people kind of the basics of things, but you can't teach people how to sing, to let their own voice kind of emerge through that learning. Mm-hmm. And so it's like a balance of letting them find their way and kind of giving them some tools in order to make that happen in the best way possible.
Sometimes the image we think of poets, these people who are so beyond us because they bring out these words that are just so beautiful, and we are little plebeians.
I'm definitely more of the June Jordan, Audre, Lorde, Nikki Finney, Lucille Clifton, so many poets who poetry is ours. Mm. One of Lucille Clifton's quotes that I always hold on to is, she says, "Something in me knows how to write poetry better than I do," and I let that lead me. And so, I've also found in my walk, the poems that I feel like are the strongest that I've written are the ones that I got out of the way of and let happen versus mm-hmm. sitting down and saying, okay, I'm going to write a poem about this today and I want it to look like this. And not that there's anything wrong with that. I do that too. Mm-hmm. I kind of jot down notes and plans, but if you don't allow some element of surprise to mm-hmm. enter, something beyond you that's inside of you to come out, then it can fall flat, mm-hmm. you know? Mm-hmm. And I think it's being open to that, open to being carried away.
Mm. Where did you grow up? Did you grow up in New York? I know you mentioned that.
No, I lived in New York for about 13 years after I graduated from Sarah Lawrence. I went to grad school there. But I actually grew up in Tennessee. Yeah, I'm from Nashville. And oldest of three girls, and very much a Southern writer and person. So I was kind of a fish out of water for several years. But all of my travels and all the different places I've lived have definitely informed my work.
What was life like for you growing up in Nashville, and how did you come to understand that poetry would be such a big part of your life?
Nashville was a great place to grow up. On my father's side, there's 7 siblings until a certain point. Then I had 3 aunts that came after when my grandmother passed away, and then my grandfather remarried, and then I had another grandmother. So coming from a big family that was very musical, very artsy, art inclined, that spirit of experimentation, of kind of following what you're feeling and using things like instruments or going to the page and using language to express yourself was always all around me. My mother was a very avid reader. She's from upstate New York. She's from Rochester, New York, and was a student activist in the 60s, part of SNCC, and doing all of those kinds of things. And so, on the shelves in our house, I was like 11 trying to read Baldwin, even though I couldn't get half of it at the time, but yeah, Alice Walker, all the great African-American writers on the shelves. So all those things were feeding me. And when I was a junior in high school, I took a creative writing class. And that's when I realized that writing, I had a natural knack for writing poetry in particular. And my teacher saw that, Mr. Brown, and he nurtured that. And he ended up kind of becoming like Mr. Holland's Opus of that school. Like, oh, wow. Generations of writers have come out of having worked with him from very young. That junior year creative writing class. Many of us since are now writers. So he planted a lot of seeds. I graduated from high school, and people don't think you can live on poetry, right? So it's like, so what are you really gonna do? And my first major in college was journalism. So I was still on the writing track, but I was like, I got to get a job. I enjoyed that as well.
Where did you go to school?
I went to 2 colleges. I started out at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, for the first about 2.5 years. And then my mother got ill, and I was out of school for 2.5 years. And then when I went back to school, I actually ended up going to a HBCU. I went to Payne College in Augusta, Georgia, and I finished at Payne. And when I returned, because during my years off, I was really heavily involved in the poetry scene in Nashville. And it was just like, okay, I'm going to stop fighting, what I really want to do. I couldn't just say the fire happened on Beeman Street at 7:00. I had to say the flames billowed through the air, just go ahead and go with it.
Right.
And so when I returned to Payne, I became an English major and graduated. And then I took off to New York. I was going to be an artiste. And so me and my first partner, we packed my little 323 and drove up the coast. A lot of adventures happened in those couple of years following undergrad, and circumstances led to me having to figure out what was next. My father, actually, I was working like I was an administrative assistant in Baltimore, of all places, because New York was a little too much for, I guess, 2 Southern girls who went up there and didn't know what they were doing. But so I was in Baltimore, and my dad was like, have you ever thought about writing greeting cards? I said, people talk about that all the time. I said, let me look into it. So I looked into the process of how to apply, and then I sent off an application and added a couple of my own poems at the end of it. And I got a call 2 weeks later. All of this was I think, spirits were looking out for me, because my partner had moved on with someone else, and it was a very hard time. It's like, oh my God, what am I going to do? And everything came through, and I found myself in Kansas City, Missouri, writing Hallmark greeting cards.
Wow.
So I did that for 5 years. So
what was that like?
It was a great job to have. It's, the way it worked was, there were editors of the different card lines, and we were, assigned to different lines depending on what they needed or what the needs were. And all the writers wrote for all the lines. editor would come in and kind of give us this market research. This is what our consumers liking these days. And we need 15 new pieces for masculine birthday. We need some to be close relationships, some that just honor the occasion. Like, they give you all of these parameters. Wow. And then they set us loose to write. And we had to get a certain amount of acceptances per project. But it was a great place to work. And not being a struggling artist was nice, So that was a very rich time. Mm-hmm. Once I kind of got the hang of what they needed from me, I was able to do a lot of my own work, and I would also do independent, like, writing workshops. One of those was Cave Canem, which national organization for Black poets that has pretty much changed the face of American poetry. So I was able to attend. And that was where I started to think about, so what do I want to do in terms of, this is good. This job is great. It's like, you got a job with benefits, girl. Hold on to it. Mm-hmm. But I didn't want the good to keep me from the best.
Yes.
And I was like, I need to give my work a real shot. I want to be on those shelves that I looked up at as a little girl. And so I actually met Nikki Finney in 2000 at Howard in the Hurston Wright Writers Week. She was leading the poetry workshop. Rice had just come out. And seeing a model of someone who was doing what I wanted to do really helped. And we kind of kept in touch after that workshop. So when I was hemming and hawing about what to do, she's just like, yeah, go for it. You're never stuck, She wrote one of my graduate school letters when I decided to go ahead to apply to grad school. And so then I was like, all right, I'm doing this. I'm going to leave the good job. Wow. And pack up and go back cross country to New York and see what happens. Mm-hmm. No guarantees. And it ended up being the right move for me.
And that's when you went to Sarah Lawrence.
Yeah.
Wonderful. It's really powerful to hear your stories you talk about, from that high school teacher and then to professionals like Nikki Finney. Just the things we get along the way, the influences that shape our art and instill courage, and then lead us to a place of coming into our own professional, our own artistic ventures. And then make it possible for us to do the same for others who are trying to crawl up the ladder as well.
Sure.
So why is poetry important, especially now? I mean, some people would say, okay, sure, we read poetry on greeting cards. We see it on the sides of bus stops. We hear it on NPR. But why is it so important, especially now?
Poetry is about human business. And we can see ourselves clearly through, all literature, but I think poetry is probably the most intimate of them in terms of, you can really make a poem yours. During tough times, during hard times, people really turn to poetry to remember, I think, the best of what humanity is able to be to each other. When things are falling apart and things are uncertain, I feel like poetry kind of breaks everything down to what's essential, what really matters. And it's been around since the first humans. So it's like, if this sitting around the fire, telling each other our stories, listening to each other's emotions is what held us together then and got us through then it's going to still work now, no matter what kind of world we're living in. That, if you're returning to that essence, seems to be the thing that saves. And I think that's why poetry is important. Self-definition, kind of creating a space where you define who you are, and the world has to accept that on your terms. Some of the poets that I admire the most tend to use poetry in that way. But again, the amazing thing about poetry is you can make it what you need it to be. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. We were talking about the Hallmark job, and the line that my work sold the best on for them was sympathy. My sympathy cards always just flew off the shelves, and it's like,
wow,
yeah, it's interesting. It's being able to kind of give language to grief, mm-hmm. or to transform it into something that doesn't consume or drown. Mm-hmm. I think that's been something that I've used poetry for. How to make this hard thing beautiful. How to take a loss and learn from it in a way that propels you forward.
What in your life you think prepared you to have that capacity, particularly as you talk about the greeting card experience?
Yeah, I think I've always thought, well, I guess that's just my personality, to be really empathetic. Mm. But my grandfather was a Methodist minister. And so the first 16 years of my life, we grew up in that church, in the church that he pastored before he retired. And then my grandmother, who I did not meet, my first grandmother passed away a year before I was born. And but everyone said about her, she was just the nicest, warmest person. And whenever anyone had a need in that church, she was the first one at the door. Mm. And so we grew up hearing many stories about her. And that sense of being that person, I guess, it's just in us too, or we were inspired by those stories, me and my sisters. So
I want to go back because I'm caught on that line. Poetry is about human business. Hmm. Please tell me you've written that in a poem somewhere. It is beautiful. I love it.
Yeah, it's I wrote an article for an online literary journal about bearing witness in poetry. Mm. And what does that mean to go beyond just looking at something and to really see it and value it and cherish it, you know? Mm. And I say that in there, that poetry is about human business.
It's beautiful. I love that. I think probably it resonates for me because in my life, poetry has really exemplified that.
Okay.
You know, and thinking about the work of Lucille Clifton and Nikki Finney and just all of these incredible poets, June Jordan, Audre Lorde, that you talked about, the poetry was accessible, meaningful, and it said something about my life as well.
And to show how we're more, as Maya Angelou said, we're more alike than we are unalike. That was a key moment. I'm thinking about college now. I was an ambassador for the Black College Fund, and so I would have to travel to different places to kind of, they put us out there to tell our story, to kind of encourage different churches to donate to the fund. And so as part of that speech, I would always do poetry as well. I would do my own poetry. And I remember one time I was in central Illinois, farmland, like just farms for miles and miles. And I was the only Black person that was there. And the young kids had never even met a Black person in person yet. It was like that remote. Wow. I think people forget that pockets of our country are still like that. Mm-hmm. But the father, when I did my speech, and then one of the poems I did was about growing up in 1980. I was like, me and my friends circa 1981. And it was just a nostalgic poem about what it was like to be 10 and grow up in that neighborhood. But the end ties into what was starting to happen as far as, drugs starting to come into neighborhoods and violence and things of that nature. And that was actually the impetus to write it, was to say, people are saying this about this neighborhood now, but I remember it like this. Like, I remember it with kids playing in the street and families and, when it was this. And so now they're saying these hard things. But after I read the poem, he was like, oh my God, that took me back to the tire swing and the homemade ice cream. And it's like he even though I was talking about chain link fences, swings and different place, it was like that sense of childhood wonder and glee he immediately connected with. And he was just, oh my God, I really love that piece. And it was like, in that moment, I was thinking, yeah, you know, when you dig deep enough into your own story that you reach everybody's story, that's what unifies people. And so I was like, I like that about poetry too. Like, poetry does all these things.
Yes.
So
maybe now you could read for us some poetry.
Absolutely. So I have 2 collections in the world. The first one is She Has a Name. And this collection largely deals with a family, and it's based on my real life family, where the youngest daughter is on the autism spectrum. And so how her journey kind of shapes a family's dynamic, how it shapes sisterhood and motherhood, fatherhood, and then how she was received or not received by people in the world. Because, you know, we were children in the late 70s, early 80s, so there wasn't a lot known about autism at that point. Now there's a breadth of things available for children. So it was always important to me to try to somehow articulate that story. And it took many years. It was something that was too close for a long time. But kind of living in the world myself as a woman and traveling far from home, you can kind of turn back to home and have some kind of perspective on it. And then also just meeting other families and other people who had similar experiences. So that's why I say it's based on my family, but some of these characters kind of become composites. You know, there's a father character, there's a mother character, sister, siblings. But some of those qualities that kind of cross all those, all borders and all categories. And everybody's like, I recognize that. So that's what that collection's about. I have poems about other things in this book too, but that's the thrust of it.
And I think it would be important to say, I'm not for sure if you know this, but the Zami Noble Book Club is featuring that collection, I think in May or June or July this year.
This is so great.
Yes, so this is absolutely wonderful that we have you here and we can share that with the readers in the book club.
Would you like me to read from that collection?
Yes, that would be wonderful.
Okay. I'll read maybe the first couple of poems.
Okay.
So the first poem is kind of a general poem that kind of sets the stage, and then the book zooms into the particular story. I'll read this with the most recent statistic. When I wrote this book, I wrote it before that, but it was published in 2013. 1 in 150 families, American families, were dealing with autism. And so I'll read it with the most recent statistic.
Okay.
This is Borderless Country. 1 in 68 now, this glitch in babies poised to unlock the world. These daughters and sons of poets, store clerks, salesmen, singers, CEOs, janitors, and actors cast into this permanent script. Souls we love turned like the faces of flowers thrust toward a rogue sun. We are the earth we walk. What seeps here? Is the air fighting back? Is the water slowing baskets down, sending them back upstream? Are we changing? Dear God, are they here to tell us in a way we can't ignore that we aren't changing fast enough? Autism, the one-drop rule for minds we strain to understand, the catch-all phrase that drops kids off at nowhere, at you don't exist once you turn 18, at native tongue of one, at white-knuckled translation cobbled through touch across time, at marquee symptoms while causes lurk, at beauty that demands seas of patience. What about that drug I took once? Vaccines, some karmic boomerang I don't remember throwing, its stealth return. 1 in 68 apples of somebody's eye, 1 in 68 my baby, 1 in 68 now a new child breathes, private riddles of our loving, strapped on many backs. Breach. It seems the most special of beings endure harrowing beginnings. The covering physician didn't know her body's history. He treated Mama with less grace than a laboring mare, almost dragging her off the table, and she had no choice as he ripped my sister into this world. Each year we depreciate. We tell ourselves that if anything must spoil, let it be us. She's worth a million urges. Hope lies in the new. Everyone knows this. Father's voice. The last thing I ever wanted was to let her down. I held her high in the bows of my biceps until her legs began to grapevine around mine. She didn't wriggle like my older girls did, restless for ground. No. Lord, no, please, not my baby girl, not the one named after Mama, gone. Mouth carved just like hers, like mine. What could I have done? Held her as long as any father's strength could stand her growing weight. What next? My chromosome limps in her bloodstream. The proof, years later, my brother's son scales this cliff. I'm not allowed to say I don't want to pay what she will cost us. I'll work myself into pulp, withhold my tongue, and practice nothingness, cockroach logic. If I don't move, I'm not really against this wall, back gleaming in harsh light. I won't hold my wife's hand and skip words like stones. I'll become a dyke of a man, fall asleep in front of the TV nightly until I burst. Mother's voice. I watched the backs of college girlfriends trailing off to mobile lives. I watched them until they were blips. Ours was a sacred exile then. Waterfalls of words between us, silhouettes in love, tending our own. The hours, clouds floating past, beds in the sky where rain slept. I often wake up dizzy, the sun mocking us as it douses her face. My husband says nothing, his kiss is shallow. What we don't say, we eat. So it opens with the shock of the diagnosis and what happens, and then coming to terms with it. And then it opens up into the beauty too, you know. It's just learning to love differently, you know, neurodiversity, a different way of being in the world.
Yes.
But those were a couple of poems from the beginning. Beautiful.
There's so many different ways I could, you know, come off of your reading from that collection. I am very tender about issues of disabilities because I know how in the world we tend to treat people who have disabilities as less than other, less intelligent, less desirable.
And it's not true.
It's not true.
Mm-hmm.
It is not true. And sometimes I wonder if a large part of those stereotypes come from our lack of exposure, of being so distant from people with various disabilities.
Sure. Absolutely. And literature allows us to kind of get peeks into and glimpses into other people's lives so that we do see that there's nothing to be scared of. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of beauty to admire and enjoy in each other. But yeah, absolutely. And I think back when we were growing up, people weren't talking about it. And so people were in these little silos, and now there are groups, people reach out to each other. There's community. Students with, you know, who are special needs are mainlined into general population. So then there's no fear around it anymore, mm-hmm. or there's less fear, I should say, mm-hmm. around it. Mm-hmm. But you're absolutely right.
Did this collection help you, in a sense, think about and celebrate your relationship with your sister?
Oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And it's been amazing to watch her grow and change over the years, and many of the things that were hard for her when she was younger aren't now. You know, mm-hmm. She's made, you know, hit all of the pretty major developmental milestones just on her timetable, mm-hmm. not on the one prescribed by society. And it's just neat to see her become. Absolutely.
Well, it's powerful the way in which you shape your the voice of the father, thinking about this in the voice of the mother. And then in between that, this notion of the way in which black women's bodies are treated by the doctor who had no care for the woman's body, which actually made me think of, we're talking about connections, Nikki Finney's poem, The Greatest Show on Earth. You know, just the way in which there is such a general disregard for black female bodies.
Absolutely. I talk about that more in the second collection, Starshine and Clay, where I talk about dealing with fibroids and doctors for years that would kind of push me off and not help me deal with the issue until it got to the point where I hemorrhaged and almost left here. Wow. But that disregard, that fighting that we have to do to be seen, you know, as whole human beings. Yes. I touch on that because that was so hard to deal with, but I touch on that in some poems here. And in the first section of Starshine and Clay, which is taken from a Lucille Clifton poem, her iconic poem, Won't You Celebrate With Me, has a line that says, you know, I made it up here on this bridge between Starshine and Clay. It's the same thing. It's talking, the first section is talking about people who were snatched from this earth unnaturally through brutality, police brutality. Poems about Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, you know, from all different points of view. Like one of the poems is from Tamir Rice's mother's point of view. You know, that's when you start getting into issues of craft, like how am I going to write about this time? You know, how do I write about these hard things in a way to make people remember? Because I think we get so bombarded with hard things that we start to get desensitized and we can't hold it. So we look away. Yes. And so these poems are, you know, again, an attempt like many other poets writing right now to document what's happened, what's occurred, what's occurring, you know. But yeah, when you talked about, you know, the treatment of the black body and understanding that these are people that are being taken from us and not a hashtag, not a statistic. That's been the thrust of a lot of the poems in the second collection, which came out in 2017.
Wonderful. Yeah. Wonderful. I think you're so right. I was looking on Facebook the other day and it was, a story that's, as I said, unbelievably unbelievable. And we hear so many things going on today that it's just so easy to turn our faces and say, not again. Yeah. I just don't have the energy. I can't do this today. I can't. Yes. I can't. And I think, you know, poetry and music and art can be that way of bringing us back in a very subtle, sometimes dark, but just in a very real way to face what it is that we need to be in conversation with as we deal with this human business of ours. So thank you for the poetry. It's just absolutely wonderful. There is a part of me that's really interested in the accessibility of art and how it is possible for us to bring into our communities, our local community centers, our schools, our churches, places of worship, our assisted living spaces, the tool of art. And I think sometimes people think that poetry and music and art is so far above us that we can't do that making of our own. What is one way that we can help people really think about their own capacity to engage art in a very meaningful way and to do it in some way that can help them turn back towards what we need to face as we deal with this human business?
You know, I like to start when I'm teaching, especially a group of people who may not write poetry regularly or be into literature, because I've taught at assisted living homes. I've taught at halfway house. I've taught poetry in many different settings. And I like to start people with where they're from, and just give them that litany. Just say where I'm from, and then use the senses to show us that, where I'm from. Kids play with kites, on a summer day, or where I'm from. Kids learn how to duck before they learn how to ride a bike. Whatever your reality is, it's like I just tell them use that that line, that mantra, but then use the 5 senses to show me where you're from. And that's always a great place to start. And then everybody in the room gets to see each other, glimpses into each other when they share out. I also like a prompt. This world takes so much from us. And so I always ask them to just free write around the idea of give me back. What do you want back? It's almost like creating the wish list, and then that can become the goal list. What do you want back? And then you can think about how to get those things back. But some really interesting pieces have come from that. People thinking about, without any kind of, like that question people ask, if money was no object, where would you live, or whatever. It's like if you could literally get back anything. And it might start with material things, but then it becomes other things. I taught in Rikers for 5 years when I lived in New York. And one guy wrote, give me back the moment before I broke my mother's heart. And it's like in jail, and there's a lot of reflection happening anyway. So poetry is a natural vehicle for them to express those things that they're already thinking about, because they're in a place where they're thinking about their choices or what's going to be next and things of that nature. And bringing in different types of poets, because people respond to different styles, When you're talking about accessibility, I was thinking about Elizabeth Alexander. I took a workshop with her, and one thing she asked all of us was, who are you writing for? Who's your audience? And again, everyone started with the kind of obvious things, like, maybe my audience is everybody. Of course, everybody starts there. It's like, well, I guess my audience is, Black people, or my audience is queer people, women. I write for women. But she just kept saying, keep going, keep going. Who are you writing for? It's actually 2 questions. Who are you writing for, and who are you writing to? And at the bottom of my well of that question was my sister, interestingly enough.
Wow.
And that really surprised me. But I was like, of course. In a lot of ways, being a kind of a translator for her with the world, so that she could enter experiences with us and breaking down complex concepts so that she could understand, that has influenced my aesthetic, my style. It's like I try to take the hard things and boil them down to their essence so that everyone can understand it. And I was just like, that makes complete sense.
Are you writing for and to her?
I think I'm writing for her to understand whatever I'm writing about. Yeah. It's interesting though, because I would have never asked myself that question, but having that insight explains so much.
Yes.
Yeah. Again, it goes to that, look at all the things that we do. We don't know why we do them until we stop for a moment and pay attention and really think about it. And I love that. And most of the writers that I admire do some form of that. They either look so closely at something that that you see in a way you've never seen it before, or they take these really hard ideas that are hard to articulate and find that way to just cut to the quick, that quick line that just lets us know this is what it is. One of my favorite lines, there's so many of hers, I could talk about her all day, but Lucille Clifton, in her poem, September Song, when she's talking about 9/11, one of her lines is it treason to remember? And it's like, she just said a world in that line. Is it treason to remember that this, to finish that line is that this country has done many things that have led to this outcome. People don't just get on a plane.
Right.
And do this because nothing's happened to them.
Right.
And to understand that in the wake of this tragedy, we have to understand our own humanness and our own weakness and the things that this country has done against its own members as Black people, right? Now, you could have written that all out, or you could say, is it treason to remember, and just blow everybody's minds like she did. Right. Right. So that's what I that's my model. Like, how do I cut to the quick of things?
I, too, am a big fan of Lucille Clifton. I love how she talks and uses the characters of Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben.
Oh, those are great.
Yes, those are great poems. And because they make our stories so real when we've been taken for granted. Just this idea of after the store closes, Uncle Ben and Aunt Jemima, strolling down the aisles of the store. And she has, and I say has because it's an enduring legacy. She has the capacity to bring us into those spaces of human business. Now, I'm never going to get rid of that. That poetry is about human business. And I think that when we see people who do that work, especially in poetry, you never forget it. It lingers with you. Maybe because it's such a distillation that it's easy to carry around with you. But that idea of just how a few words packaged so rightly make it possible for us to go into so many different places.
Or that image, like that indelible image that represents an idea. Yeah, yes. How that can do that as well.
Yes. In terms of, making poetry accessible or helping people think about how they can really enter into the art, there's something else I wanted to talk to you about because it's this idea, and people call it the imposter syndrome. I'm not for sure if I like that, only because I think that it is quite one-sided. It does not speak to why and what someone can feel as if they're an imposter, and particularly in environments where you feel like your work, because you're brown, because you're Black, because you're queer, because you're a woman, because you're a person with a disability, all these things can have a weight on you that you sometimes have to feel like you have to throw off before you do creative work. But it's that idea of, I'm doing this, but my work isn't good enough. So I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to put it on YouTube. I'm not going to put it on Facebook. I'm not going to discuss this work that comes from me because I don't know if it's good enough as the next person. And some people really struggle with that when it comes to living in the world in a very creative way. What do you say to that?
Well, there was so much in what you just said. In terms of all of those isms and marginalization, Toni Morrison kind of broke that open for me. It's like, is this good enough? Is it good enough for whom? She always said when she, Ellison's Invisible Man, she was like, invisible to whom? To center yourself in your own story and not think about any other gaze, whether it's the white gaze or the male gaze or, whatever.
GAZE for people who need to know.
Yes, thank you. Yes. Whoever's looking. And to really just center your own thoughts and feelings and emotions as what matters. And I think that's what makes her such a powerhouse, is that she's managed to do that in all of her work. These are fully realized, dignified people in all circumstances that she's writing about in her novels. And they're not thinking about what white people think of them, or they're not, it's not thinking about who's going to accept this book and give it an award, any of that. It's like, I'm just going to be, and either you're going to, you know, anyone who is watching are going to be forced to acknowledge, you know, what shortcomings they might have in not being able to fully see what's happening. But I'm not going to take that on. Right. And so I think she's a model of that. And maybe I understand how fortunate I was to kind of grow up in an environment, in a community that just made the children in it feel like you could do anything. And of course, you know, what you have to say is important. And so that work, when you don't have that kind of validation, and that kind of confirmation, I think I didn't have that so much. But when I recognize it in students, I just say the same things to them that I heard all those years. And I used to have the younger kids, we ended every session with, I have a voice. My voice is powerful. My voice can change the world. And I remember at first they thought that was corny, but by the end of of our time together, we had several weeks together. They couldn't wait to get to that part, and they were yelling it, you know.
Wow. Yeah.
And so, you know, I just think about, even when I've taught speech and looking at different speeches, and, you know, you can have kind of this highbrow rhetoric that speaks to people and is beautiful. But Sojourner Truth, in her voice and in the way that she spoke, "Ain't I a Woman?" that tore it all down. You know, it made the case rhetorically for how crazy racism and the intersection of racism and sexism was by that one rhetorical question. You know, and it's like, I am both of these things, and look at what my life has been, and I'm gonna stand here and witness. You do with that what you will, you know.
Right. You know, it as I listen to you, I think about just the reality of public perception, and at the same time, the reality of our own standing in our truth and our creative arts. You know, that we have a reality, and it's kind of what you said about Toni Morrison. Well, who cares who's looking, and who is this for? I know what the perception is, but there's something much larger, because I have a voice.
Yes.
And I can make a difference, and that's very powerful. So I can see that being just a very gift to those young writers and poets.
And I would learn so much from young writers, because they, you know, as you get older, you kind of have these ideas about things and what things are and what they're capable of, and young people aren't set yet, so they see things very creatively, and I try to encourage that too when I'm working with them. They aren't jaded, you know, or they haven't been sold that this is what this is and it can be nothing else, and so that kind of helps me to remember to play and to be open when I come to the page too. Don't go to what your preconceived notions are about things. Try to see it in this moment now, as it is, you know, without bringing all of that to the table, which is hard.
Yes.
Yeah, but it's worth.
Yes,
the inquiry is worth the attempt.
Before we leave, would you read us some more poetry?
It's interesting. We've been talking about me as a teacher, and we've been talking about racism. That I ended up writing a poem about an incident with a student that had a hard time accepting me as her professor. Yes, that involved issues around privilege and how it took me by surprise. And then I was like, why are you surprised? You know? But it did. And I named it Fannie Lou Hamer with the epigraph, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I actually found out that poem was accepted for Best American Poetry 2019.
Wow.
So that's going to come out in September, but
congratulations.
Thank you so much. But I think I'm going to share that one just because when you're by yourself and you're literally writing to try to make sense of something that just happened to you, or to take the feeling from burning in your chest and put it on the page, so that you can start to look at it and move on from it, heal from it. You don't know where it's going to end up. You don't know
right.
how it's going to move without you in the world. And so the trajectory of this poem has been so interesting because it's like the student left out of the office and I just started writing because I was just like, what was that? What just happened here? And so it was for my own kind of clarity and peace of mind. But so many people have responded to it. I got a postcard from Hawaii from a woman that was like, I can already see that you're probably an amazing teacher, and how sad for that student that she's not going to know that she deprived herself of the privilege of knowing you as a teacher. And then I've had other teachers write and say, yes, that's happened to me, particularly professors of color. Again, giving voice to these things that we're grappling with so that we don't feel alone.
Yes.
So this is Fannie Lou Hamer. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. She sat across the desk from me, squirming. It was stifling. My suite runs hot, but most days it is bearable. This student has turned in nothing, rarely comes to class. When she does, her eyes bore into me with a disdain born long before either of us. She doesn't trust anything I say. She can't respect my station, the words coming out of these lips, this face. My breathing is an affront. It's me, she says. I never was the student's professor. Her immediate reaction seeing me at the smartboard. But I have a calling to complete, and she has to finish college, return to a town where she doesn't have to look at, listen to, or respect anyone like me. Forever tall, large, and brown in her dagger eyes, though it's clear she looks down on me. She can return, if not to her hometown, another enclave, so many others, where she can brush a dog's golden coat, be vegan, and call herself a good person. Are you having difficulty with your other classes? No. Go, I say tenderly. Loaded as a cop's gun, she blurts out point blank that she's afraid of me, twice. My soft syllables rattle something planet deep, so I tell her to go where she'd feel more comfortable, as if she were my niece or godchild, even wish her a good day. If she stays the ways this could backfire, where is my Kevlar shield from her shame? There's no way to tell when these breasts will evoke solace or terror. I hate that she surprises me, that I allow myself to think her ilk is gone despite knowing so much more and better. I can't proselytize my worth all semester, exhaust us for the greater good. I can't let her make me a monster to myself. I'm running out of time and pity the extent of her impoverished heart. She's from New England, I'm from the Mid-South. Far from elderly, someone just raised her like this with love. I have essays to grade, but words warp on the white page, dart just out of reach. I blink 2 hours away, find it hard to lift my legs, my voice, my head precious to my parents now being held in my own hands. How did they survive so much worse, the millions with all of their scars? What would these rivers be without their weeping, these streets without their faith and sweat? Fannie Lou Hamer thundered what they felt, we feel, into DNC microphones on black and white TV years before I was a notion. She doesn't know who Fannie Lou Hamer is, and never has to.
Ashe. Ashe. Yes.
Yeah.
it's poignant because we do have to face that and realize that young woman's privilege is something that we face often.
Yes. And I could tell that she was struggling with how she felt like she was wrong for how she felt, but she couldn't help herself. Mm-hmm. Like there was a point when she said, "It's me, not you." Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it was like you could feel it coming off of her. It was like she felt like she was taking directions from the help. Mm-hmm. She could not reconcile that.
Right.
And so she ultimately left. Yeah. Well, I like to do two short ones.
Okay.
This one isn't, everything's political, so I'm not going to say this isn't political, but this is an ode to Cassandra Wilson that I wrote. So I can share that. Because that's in the book too. There's a lot of poems about beautiful things here.
And from which collection is this?
Starshine and Clay.
Okay, wonderful.
Cassandra. Grand Canyon voice echoing across centuries. I leaned forward as far as I could, fearless of falling in. Contralto siren whose lips grazed the mic like a kiss on the collarbone. Birth lava tones that spread through the melting crowd. Octopus voice, touching everywhere at once, light enough to ride May's sweet evening breath, deep enough to ease that low throbbing pain like grandma humming Mahalia. Honey-locked songbird, copper curves embraced by burgundy silk, moved thousands with a moan, the bass drum guitar lacing a hammock of sound for her voice to recline in. She hopscotched Mississippi mud rhythms, bellowed notes from reddened fields, made old lovers remember the salt of each other's skin. She turned us into magnolias parting for rain.
Beautiful.
Yeah, that was amazing to see her live. Her voice is so ancient. It's like it's now, but you can hear her forever in it.
Yes. Yes.
I can go ahead and read this one. Catskills Retreat. On a mountain, all moonglow, toad moan in green majesty, I've come, since it wouldn't come to me, to make peace at the foot of heaven, haul it home somehow. The steepness of my soul overwhelms, housed in this bear of a body. Prophets prove that mountains midwife great reckoning. The heart's read psalms in concert with the hummingbirds whirring. Thoughts linger a while, embraced by the naked mind. God-flecked cypress and pine, I can't stand tall with you. Knees too burdened to hike trails and dash meadows, I am fat with failure and promise. A pile of damp timber just before sunrise. I take cool, high-altitude breaths and recall other heights, gaze at humbling shoulders of earth brushing up against brazen blue. Channel a lily pad lightness upon woman-made depths to face matters long past skimming. As fingers press prayers into crumbling quartz, bless my fellow travelers and the blades of grass forgiving our steps, springing back up. Bless the beaver beginning again and again, the monarch's meandering flight. Bless these mosquitoes in their insatiable thirst, the blue jays at dawn trilling, you are not through.
Unfortunately, we are through.
We are through.
But it has been a wonderful conversation.
Oh, yes.
Thank you for stopping by and sharing in our Black lesbian herstory.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's been a pleasure.
What a great interview with Kamilah Aisha Moon. Poetry is human business. Ashe, ashe, ashe. Thank you, Kamilah, for spending time with me and sharing your creative genius with us on the Zami Nobla podcast. For those of you who are interested in her work, please check the show notes for more information. As always, we appreciate you for listening to the podcast. And if you have any feedback or comments, please feel free to leave them where you found the podcast, or you can email me podcast@zaminobla.org. Thanks for listening and have a sweet one.